And I actually really observed the long-term effects of cultural erasure. It's very interesting to see the bridge rebuilt.
Yeah.
But the fact that libraries, theaters, most of the schools, the public parks became cemeteries. And most of those haven't been rebuilt at the scale that they were before. And I could really sense it in the current cultural framework, let's call it, or lack of cultural framework, where I felt very strange to actually go back and see what has happened, and in many ways that it really succeeded what they were trying to do. So I'm wondering if you had any specific observations on that in terms of how and what should be rebuilt or shouldn't be rebuilt, because part of my frustration was actually by rebuilding the bridge completely, and which for obvious reasons. My family goes back about 300 years there, and New York is actually my home now. I don't think I could ever live there again, unfortunately. But it was interesting to see that the actual rebuilding process in many ways literally erases what happened there.
Yes.
So I don't know if it's slightly, it's a schizophrenic, I guess, relationship, at least from my end as an architect, is the way I would like to put it. So I'm not sure if you had specific insight on your, additional thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, the Mostar context, I guess, is very particular in a way, in the sense that the bridge, for better or worse, became a focal point for rebuilding, and not just in the Balkans, but as far as I understand, it's one of only 2 sites in the world, the other one being the city of Warsaw, where it was created as a World Heritage Site after it was destroyed. And so, yes, I mean, being there in Mostar very briefly, I could definitely see, which was in, I think, probably 2015 or so, I would have been there. I could see the problems in terms of the way that the bridge and the rebuilding of the bridge was given focus, and the situation, as you say, in the other parts of Mostar. I didn't spend enough time there to see it comprehensively, but from what people tell me before we went there and afterwards, unfortunately, there are a lot of tensions still there, and problematic issues, as you say, with rebuilding, and the fact that the bridge has, taken a lot of focus. But I guess, I mean, I imagine, it's similar to what most other people, particularly Bosnians, tell me of, the fact that unfortunately the Dayton Accords haven't really done anything to help heal. And so, I know that say Amila, for example, who speaks in the film, she's sort of really...
Who I'm in contact with, actually. It's a small tribe, yes.
Oh, good. I mean,
we should probably have a separate session, I mean,
Amila, when has been on television a couple of times trying to get other states to help try to explore the constitutional situation there, and trying to remedy some of the issues that the Dayton Accords have caused,
Well, I think, sorry, I mean, I know we're in the queue before Nader goes on, so I'm just going to pick your brain. I know for me also, even within the culture of Bosnia, it's very complex, because I often get into these situations where I feel even what happened in Mostar hasn't been recognized to a full degree, because it is a separated city, but it was also attacked both by Serbs and Croats. Not just by one, and it's currently occupied by Croats, and there's still 2 police stations, 2 school systems. I was told that Bosnian kids still get beat up if they try to do anything outside without their parents, and it was hard for me to watch that, because you have this idealized city that's been rebuilt for this beautiful bridge and tourists coming. And I saw all of them as an architect, as somebody who really went into architecture because I saw buildings get obliterated. I have a slight love-hate relationship with urban preservation, I'll be honest, because it doesn't, what's being preserved and what's being rebuilt and what shouldn't be preserved and shouldn't be rebuilt, as a reminder to everyone, is a critical question from my end. And I find that to be just as heart-wrenching as the human loss. And it's a very personal part for me because I also happen to have been wounded during that time there. And I spent 2 years of my life, you know, literally across the world trying to deal with things that no child should probably deal with. But nothing compares to seeing what happened now, you know, 25 years later, and realizing that actually it hasn't really healed. So I wonder what, you know, 10 years from now, what part 2 to your work would look like in terms of going back and retracing or even interviewing, you know, I guess the cultural interface, how, you know, some of the survivors have tried to move on, but perhaps couldn't because of what was done. I teach at the Cooper Union, so I should just say the reason why I'm so verbal is because I'm part of the architecture school. So just to give you a heads up.
I mean, look, I mean, I'm always interested to hear, you know, like for you, what do you feel could be done more by the international community, whatever that is, which I know is another problematic term.
I know.
You know, to try to help, you know, to help, I suppose, is just one way of putting it. I mean, you know.
I mean, for me, it was obviously what happened in Mostar was also before the advent of internet and social media and recognizability of what occurred. I think we were really in a dark hole for several years. And what was happening there was literally hidden from the masses and from the globe. And to be honest, the international community, I remember them putting white flags on all of the cultural institutions, and the soldiers actually using those white flags to obliterate all of the libraries, the theaters, the schools, almost like day one. And then it blew my mind that eventually, you know, 5 years later, when US intervened gently and actually helped divide Bosnia as part of the so-called peace agreement. So we kind of literally got, you know, brutalized again. I know from the Serbian and the Croatian counterforce, they felt so, you know, unjustly treated. You know, it's very much what was described during the court trials that were the longest in the history of the court in Hague. Where they felt that they were mistreated by actually being slightly reprimanded for what they did on their own for over 4 or 5 years. But based on what I saw after 17 years last year, I wish that the bridge in Mostar at least wasn't rebuilt at all, but that they focused more on libraries and schools and cultural institutions that actually can rebuild and bring new memory, as opposed to iconic bridge that kind of gives you the illusion that the city is connected again, because it's not. That bridge doesn't, you know, it doesn't actually tell you that there are still, you know, severe segregation between the two sides. And at the moment, the Croats are actually buying properties legally on the Bosnian side. So it's getting, now it's actually getting obliterated legally as well. I mean, sorry, I know so much about this, but I was so moved by what you just showed us and the global impact. But I'm just wondering, this whole idea of the urban preservation is very problematic actually for me in terms of what gets chosen to be reconstructed, and how do you actually make sure that it's the right thing to do.
It's look, I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about this, and we, you know, I definitely can. I'd love to interchange with you more. But I suppose, long story short, I mean, you know, I mean, Neda and I talked about this in our conversation. I think of like, this is the problematic thing where architecture becomes
An icon.
Focal, yeah, and I mean, often, you know, these structures carry a message about power, and you know, the bridge did before in a different way, and that gets hijacked easily. You know, and I think, yeah, look, the rebuilding of the bridge clearly, it was, I think, to make the international community feel better.
Right.
You know,
that's exactly what it was. Yes.
you see that happening now in discussions about the Buddhas of Bamiyan perhaps being rebuilt, and it's got nothing to do with the Afghani people who live there. Right. It's just trying to send some well-meaning message, but nevertheless one that's not particularly constructive about the reality of the situation.
Anyway, but I was blown away by I really appreciate what you did.
Thank you.
Well, Nader just joined.
Mauricio, you're going to be co-hosting this tonight.
I know. I've been chatting for the last 20 minutes. I hijacked the...
I've already spoken to Tim for 15, 20 minutes in the prior thing. I don't know if everybody has seen that, or is that something that people went straight to the film? Do we know?
I'm not sure.
I screened it before screening the film. But on the website, they were both available at the same time. So
sort of doesn't make sense, though, to have that interview and then in this interview. But I suppose we can hash out some of the stuff a little bit, not making it too redundant, but making sure that we go full circle around this discussion. But Mauricio, I'll ask you to engage the process if I can.
Okay, I will.
Mix it up a little bit.
Sounds good.
I see that we have some other people online.
I see Farnoosh as well, and I wonder, I'm sure she'll have a few things to say about what we saw, and Elizabeth. I think for me, the biggest question is this, issue of urban preservation, and how does that cultural memory and how the chosen gradients of program are selected to obviously help heal. I think you used the word heal, Tim, very specifically. And I think for many people, reconstruction of the bridge in Mostar did heal them visually, perhaps. But for me, what was really apparent, after going back, after almost 2 decades of being absent from that forum, is that the so-called term that originated in Mostar, which is culturalcide, the genocide of culture, was really succeeded, because the libraries, the theaters, I could see it in the new generations. I could see it in the way they were talking to me. I could see it in all of it. And it was just kind of the phase 2, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what was even worse is that, it's a divided city without a physical wall in it. And this bridge that everybody loves, I also took photos of it, was blown away by it and happy to see it, admittedly. But it really, it unrattled me, because it's actually a lie in many ways in terms of what's happening there in Europe right now. It's not a bridged city at all. It's literally divided, and it's actually getting obliterated legally now, because they're legally buying properties on the Bosnian side. And redeveloping them. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they won. They have the money, they have the resources, and the Bosnian side does not. So I think for me, I would have loved to see what we call in architecture the specifications and the hierarchy of importance. In terms of, is it better to rebuild the small library that maybe many people didn't know about, as opposed to a famous bridge that everybody knows about, and see if that smaller library has maybe a bigger impact than the kind of the international icon, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you feel that, sort of back to asking you, I know it's a massive question of how can people help? Like, is it about, I guess one, it's about some sort of constitutional reform, isn't it? Of the fact that the Dayton Accords have have helped preserve these tensions and this separation of people. That, I mean, there are things like, you know, try to encourage more of an international focus on Bosnia. I'd be interested to try and help explore more in what ways people, you know, members of the international community can somehow help to, you know, and of course, you know, as we're touching on, you know, obviously Bosnia doesn't get much focus.
We don't have any oil, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. So
we don't.
But you know, it's troubling because, you know, you see Russia trying to get involved in causing.
Oh yes.
Between Serbia and Kosovo
and they're getting involved even now as we speak.
Right.
Again,
So, you know, it's something that needs to be, you know, addressed.
I guess for me, another part that I was really moved by is that you seem to have been looking at both sides of the sword. You documented the fact that injustice was felt both by the aggressor and the victim. And I thought that was a really powerful, you know, eyes wide open moment, because I've actually encountered people, you know, New York, it's such a diverse city, and it's my home now and has been for the last 25 years, but I've actually met random, you know, individuals from both Serbia and Croatia who, you know, will admittedly tell me how unjustly they feel they were treated.
Yes.
By the US, you know, and I would also say, well, you know, take a look at what you did for 5 years, and it's funny to me because I also feel the involvement of the US, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, in many ways victimized Bosnia again, because the Dayton Agreement literally divided us and sold, you know, for example, Mostar is sold to Croatia. According to that agreement.
Yeah.
So it's all Bosnian, but it's really not. Like I wouldn't, you know, it was interesting last year when I went back and, you know, you really captured it. I had to literally buy a map because they changed the names of all of the streets on the so-called Croatian side. And they didn't do it because the names were confusing. They did it because they wanted to create their own new history. So somebody who used to be Bosnian, who knew this, whose family lived there for the last 400 years, who is now literally, you know, technically a victim of genocide. I literally got lost because I couldn't find what I remember the streets used to be called. And it's all part of that erasure of memory, you know. So if you're now that 18-year-old child that was born after this all finished, you would think that the owners of these streets and the urban, you know, landscape were there for hundreds of years. So that's also interesting, that nomenclature and the idea of history is continuously rewritten. And I really appreciate that you really expose that, like to what level of a legal degree do they go, because they're actually incredibly intelligent, the aggressors, in terms of how they you know, formulate their own world, so to speak, and legally find ways to get around it. And I wonder maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on some of those, how the system is also misused to protect the aggressor in some ways. Like why did why did it take 25 years for the court to reach a consensus as to who should be punished for the genocide they committed in Bosnia 25 years ago? It was the longest standing trial, which to me is just insane.
I mean, this is a big issue, is the international justice, and the fact that, you know, it's notoriously very hard to achieve, and there's definitely, I mean, what I've noticed is, yes, particularly Serbians feeling very, very wronged, you know, in the court. And I noticed, I think it was last year when one of the at the trial, I'm trying to remember his name, the who took poison once he.
Oh yes, the Croatian general who was in charge of all of the atrocities in Mostar. Yes.
That was very troubling and interesting that when that happened, that parts of Croatian television sort of presented that as a martyrdom and.
Correct.
And so I mean, I find it's difficult because I do, I think that international law and courts are needed, absolutely, but there's this massive resistance by any state to be accountable is really troubling.
But I would also, if I may, add, what's interesting to me when that general, and I can't remember his name right now, but I know that he was a Croat who was justifiably, set for this verdict, and he took his own life in front of everybody, proclaiming that he was innocent. He committed crimes against humanity. I can literally give you names of individuals that I know directly that his armies, it wasn't hooligans, it was literally armies with tanks, and it was all curated what they did. And I remember actually, yes, the Croats made him into a martyr, but so did the New York Times in many ways, because they spoke more about they spoke more about the fact that he drank the poison than the actual victims and what he did. So I thought in many ways, we're also in the blind, and maybe it's because US is more geographically removed from that part of Europe.
Yeah.
But I found it very strange to, somebody who's made New York my home for the last 25 years, to be reading about this general who changed my life directly and most of my family's lives. And, he killed himself. And that was the story. Not why.
And as you say, the story ends up being this very sensational act that.
Correct.
Look, I mean, this is the thing. Power protects itself so well, and you saw that with Milosevic, and still the belief that he wasn't that bad by some people, and. Yeah, I mean, power will just protect itself as well as it can, and others will protect its. I mean, that's that court, the decision where the Brazilian judge that we mentioned in the film talked about coming back to Lemkin's ideas. That was out of frustration that within the court they couldn't. That was a genocide trial between Serbia and Croatia of co-accusing each other. And it ended up being thrown out because of the fact that you've got two nation states trying to, for them to kick into the long grass the ability to charge one another for these crimes is sort of too easy when you've got the level of pressure, I guess,
to keep peace. Yeah,
because it's a United Nations court.
Right.
It's very there's really no easy way around it.
Sorry, I monopolized the conversation. You have to jump in.
Continue. I just want to bring some formality to the introduction. I don't want to stop the conversation. More than anything, we have about 15 plus attendees, and because it's so small, it's a seminar, and I'm going to welcome everybody to speak up as we go forth. But before I do that, a welcome back to Tim Slade with his film, The Destruction of Memory. You and I did speak a little bit a few days ago, and we can expand on some of those discussions. Because this is an academic setting also, and in particular a School of Architecture, some of the ideas that you present in your movie are in many ways emotional to us. not only because they deal with the destruction of a people, but that the vehicle for their destruction are buildings. And we, in a way, personify buildings in many ways. We emotionalize them, and they gain an identity that we understand so deeply. But if you remember in our own discussions, I was interested in the problem of representation and its predicaments. Symbols are not always easy. I would say to Mircea, it's obvious that the bridge in Mostar was rebuilt because it was the easiest symbol, but it didn't necessarily maintain the breadth and depth of the fabric around it, which needed to be sustained. When we talk about sustainability in this day and age, we're not talking about nature itself. We're talking about social sustainability, economic viability, and the role that the environment plays in that whole cycle. In the context of the construction of memory, the example that I brought to Tim was one of my favorite architectural relics. It is the mosque in Cordoba, which embodies the tensions and the manifestations of cultures at cultural war with each other. Interestingly enough, the destruction there is based on overlay, of superposition, of hybridization. It does many things that are exciting architecturally as much as they are scandalous culturally. Consider for a second, Tim, the role of all of the things we do outside of declared war. When we see graffiti on the walls of New York City, are they just some kids that don't have anything to do, or is it an act of dissent? It is an act of rebellion. Is there a message in there for those who do not have an economic or a social voice otherwise? When we see the transformation of the East Village, not far from where you live, from what it was to what it is today, is gentrification a form of warfare, or is it the natural passage of time and evolution? Another problematic case, and maybe Tim, you can weigh in on this one to open up the conversation. Not long ago, and still alive, there's been a lot of debate about the Confederate monuments in the South. They too represent a people and a culture and a way of life that may not be what you and I support today, but there are others that live and would die by those tenets. And so I wonder if you can weigh in on the notion of cultural destruction when it comes to symbols like Confederate monuments, because that really plays out in the national politics today, even though it is an unsaid thing often. But the divisions that we witness in the United States are very much along certain cultural lines. And the Confederate monument, in a way, embodies that, that rift.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sort of in short, the general perspective I have on Confederate monuments is that I think in post-communist parts of Eastern Europe, there's been a successful repositioning of statues of Stalin, for example, in Budapest, where there are parks built which can house those statues. You know, they were moved from the center of focus in the city and put into the memorial park where they can be studied for what what the history of them is, what the process of political and social process was under that led to those statues being erected, and so I think I do think that violence encourages more violence. So I think sort of the violent removal of those things is problematic, and as is, I think, the hiding of them, which I know has happened in some cases, because to your point, that is a red rag to a bull for people who do feel that they are, that is their heritage. So I think, what's successful is when there's some way to study those objects and what role they play in, systemic racism, and how a lot of them were erected for propaganda purposes, rather than as pure heritage.
Well, it should be said a lot of those were built in the 20th century. They're
exactly.
They're contemporary, actually.
Yeah, so
exactly.
they're not authentic in that way. So I think what else can be interesting too is where another artist responds to them. I'm trying to think where, but there's certainly cases of where an African American artist has created something by keeping the object in place, but responding to it in that place as well, to sort of address these new ways of looking at what that object is and what message it's sent and what it's doing today. And so I think,
but let's not forget, when you say that, the operations that an artist undertakes on a historic monument, whether it's historic or more contemporary, happens to target an audience which is like yourself and myself in the corners of culture,
right,
which do not actually touch the urban condition and the community that monument upholds, if that is a monolithic community. It's also the wars that are played out are not necessarily in the same time and in the same place. Do you not have a problem with the way in which these monuments become naturalized by virtue of their organic fit into the public squares and spaces to which they belong? They're not objectified or are framed in the theoretical light that you're putting it. They are actually very much of the people and of the beliefs.
Sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, look, well, then in that case, maybe, yeah, if that community is very homogenous, and it's only outsiders who have a problem with it, maybe then there isn't as much of an issue. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it depends if, racism and racist symbols are a problem anywhere, or if it's only when someone's being offended by them in that place, I guess.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm just posing impossible scenarios that you can't overcome. But I'm posing them because this is the problem that we face constantly in architecture, of these irreconcilable situations where artifacts have this capacity to contain meaning. That means that they also have the capacity to transform their meanings over time based on the audiences that uphold those relics.
Right.
And project onto them new functions and new meanings and so forth.
Yeah.
What, in your mind, you brought up the question of the kind of integrity of the identity of a community. It so happens that there are countries and regions of the world where the kind of the consistency of either racial, cultural, or definitions of communities remain intact, but the United States is built on a platform of heterogeneity. And even the destruction of the World Trade Center in many ways was a kind of challenge to American dominance or capitalism or something larger. But what's poignant is that many of those who lost their lives, of the 3,000, were of course of very many different denominations, including many Muslims, of course. So what do you think, how does this argument hold itself in face of a culture that is becoming increasingly heterogeneous, where notions of ethnic divisions are becoming even more complicated?
Sorry, just could you just go back to the thrust of the question?
In a world that is following the American model, only insofar as we are becoming global citizens, there is much more immigration and hybridization of identities. It is impossible to define me as Iranian.
Right.
It is really impossible to define me as American as such.
Right.
I don't know if you identify yourself as Australian or not, but I'm saying in a world that is increasingly complex in its ethnic heterogeneity, how does, where will the argument of this destruction of memory go when it's already complicated in terms of the peoples and the identities that we hold? Basically, I'm saying that Lemkin's notion of cultural genocide also requires the consistency and the integrity,
right,
of a culture.
Yeah, I mean, look, yes. So this is the Lemkin's ideas, factor in this idea of a long-standing identity that in which development of that and transformation of that are not necessarily taken into account. So so this is a challenge of how, and indeed it's a challenge of, because there are so many if we preserved everything, then we'd very quickly run out of space. I suppose I'm finding it tricky, though, to look at it in the context of the United States today, because to me, under the current administration, there's been such a massive, what I see as a final stand to oppose that sort of heterogeneous identity of America, and so much division mongering. So I find that hard to answer to at the moment.
Well, let me try to expand on it. And then this will be my last question before I call on others to engage. And of course, as far as I'm concerned, Lemkin is one of the heroes of the 20th century. But I do think it's important to challenge the premises on which we lay some of these tenets. The essentialization of culture, I would argue, is problematic. Because my characterization of the United States was just an excuse to also demonstrate that even places like Iran, that have a very clear definition of borders, is defined by an incredibly eclectic series of religions, of ethnic subdivisions, and histories. And much like Mircea described a little bit earlier in terms of the renaming of streets, the essentialization of its Islamic identity is a very new phenomena that happened since the revolution some 40 years ago. But in fact, it has a very different history that rides behind it. So I guess, do you not find the essentialization on which Lemkin's argument requires a problematic beginning point? And how would you redefine it to sustain his argument, but not on those premises?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what's interesting, and something you said just triggered a way of looking at it for me, is that, you know, the way that Amila Butorovich just talks about what her childhood was like, and Messiah may well identify with this too, is that for her Sarajevo, you know, the identity and the culture in Sarajevo was very, very heterogeneous. It was very mixed, and was one in which, you know, identity as a Muslim was within a very specific context where they weren't, where this separation and this push towards, I guess, these siloed identities wasn't present, and that's what's caused it. So I mean, you know, I'm just throwing ideas around in my head, but I see there the fact that when those divisions were encouraged, that Lemkin's ideas came more into focus, and you know, cultural genocide became a problem, but and was one in which the sort of identity markers that he was talking about as, you know, as important to one of those groups came under attack. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of uneasy relationships there between the sort of stasis and the concrete nature of you know, this sort of almost preordained kind of identity that Lemkin was trying to talk about, and the fact that, I don't know, what I see is interesting was that, you know, in Sarajevo before these issues, there wasn't this idea of a clear demarcation of identity.
Right.
You know, it was only by doing that problems started to emerge.
And I wonder also, you know, to help answer Nader's point in regards to I think you really addressed it when you said that violence, you know, propagates more violence in regards to the removal of the Confederate statues. I would say another part that I've at least observed is that usually the victim is the really less nationalistic entity, right?
Right.
So in many ways, you know, I also, the way I grew up in Mostar, my family we were culturally Muslim. And we also celebrated almost every holiday. Every neighbor did. We went to all of the events, parties, and my family decided not to leave because we just were pacifists and didn't think that anything horrible would happen. But I would argue that in many ways, and maybe this is also our current state with, you know, having, for example, a president who is openly prejudiced, is that often the aggressors feel so passionate about their views and they're so nationalistic that the other tribe, you know, by default, because they're so much more diffused and welcoming. I know for me as a Bosnian, you know, even now it's very hard to talk about those things because we try to be always polite and embracing, right? As opposed to really feeling that we were, I guess the fact that you were not in the aggressor role to begin with is already indicative that it will be a long path of, you know, towards justice, whatever that word means. Exactly. But I thought your statement about violence or violent acts encouraging more or making them feel even more powerful. It's kind of this strange paradox in this algorithm that, you know, the victim just continues to be victimized without even realizing it.
I noticed that we have one question from Nancy Cohen. Nancy, because we're such a small group, I wondered if you want to pose the question yourself and elaborate on it. Nancy?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep, I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if there's more elaboration. I was just really struck by that because I was in Paris when the fire happened, and the world reaction was so grave and great. And so I've often thought about when I've been to Native American sites and what does a small cactus in the middle of the desert, why is that, and can that be as important as an edifice? And what is the quality of what makes it sacred, really sacred to the people? And yeah, so you can expound on that any way you'd like. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, what interested me about Notre Dame was, and it's funny actually, because there's even discussion about it that I saw this week because of the COVID-19, and it's putting at jeopardy the rebuilding plans for Notre Dame. Yeah, I mean, there's this hierarchy that's constructed that, again, is about power. I mean, there's a whole lot of things, I think, playing into that. One is the power of the Catholic Church, but more primarily the power of, obviously Notre Dame is not a Catholic site any longer. It belongs to the French nation. But, it was amazing seeing the reaction to rebuild it, to throw money at it to rebuild, and then an amazing backlash was fascinating. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I mean, as much as I feel strongly for Notre Dame and for everything it is, but trying to approach those imbalances between cultural sites is very tricky. But it is problematic. The fact that and it gets back to what Mauricio was talking about before. It's probably more, it can be more powerful to rebuild something and to show empathy for something that was smaller and less strident in its message. And also there was no, again, and similar to Palmyra, in terms of Notre Dame, there's this rush to immediately rebuild it as it was and to throw money at that approach, or to, have a competition of different rebuilding approaches where, I don't know, yeah, where there's very outlandish things which are suggested architecturally, which perhaps have nothing to do with what a new message for Notre Dame could be, but are just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what sort of money is involved with those rebuilding sort of competitions, but it would be interesting to hear what architects feel about those sorts of, open calls for.
Yeah. It would be interesting to hear what they say about, all the sacred lands in the West that are being, Southwest and the West, Northwest, that are being taken over by oil pipelines and all these things, where these people they have no stake in the game. There's no way they can represent themselves in the world you're speaking of, and it's just so unjust. And
yeah. I mean, and I don't. Yeah, it is, and I don't. I don't think there was enough learned by people around that push back against Notre Dame. There's sort of, there was this justifiable outrage, I know, from Indigenous Australians who were trying to, just down the road from Notre Dame is the Musée de Quai Branly, which, is having a struggle about whether or not to return Indigenous items. And, Yeah, I mean, they were furious. They felt their culture was incredibly minimized in the face of this sort of hand-wringing over a cathedral.
I'm sorry, what museum was that? I didn't catch.
The Musée de Quai Branly. It's the museum of I'm trying to think of the word they use, maybe not indigenous, but of sort of First Nations peoples, I think. Which of course, this then gets into another interesting discussion of, it's a great museum in terms of the fact that it's celebrating those cultures, but of course, as with any museum, a whole lot of the items are how they came to be there, and
Yeah.
Is another story. So.
I believe we have another question by
Thank you. Thanks.
Alexandra Hernandez. If you could, I'm going to unmute you, Alejandra. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I was lucky enough to see Palmyra and Aleppo and Crac de Chevalier Castle in Syria around 10 years ago, just before the war started. And I'm well aware that Aleppo will take maybe several lifetimes to go back to its full glory. But studying about the damage done to Palmyra, which was really a global tragedy, as is it the most complete ruins that there are in the world. Does the Syrian government have announced any effort to start putting them back together, whatever was left of them? And especially in the parts, some parts are still intact, but some parts were damaged, although the pieces are lying somehow there. So is there any concrete efforts to start rebuilding anytime soon that you know of?
The last that I heard was that UNESCO were doing sort of missions to Palmyra to assess feasibility of how to approach what to do with the site. I think that the sort of burst of global attention that Palmyra got in terms of rebuilding it has sort of been refocused, I think. I mean, I think that given that the conflict still is going on there and that a whole lot of other sort of attacks and criminal acts have happened since then, I think a concrete plan for rebuilding it may be a while off, or of what to do with the site. And I think, unfortunately, say for Aleppo, it's how much of it goes back to what it was is very unlikely, because I think what Assad is doing is, and this is again this sort of erasure, that another level of erasure, and what happens to the victims is that even while the siege was still going on in Aleppo, Assad was handing out rebuilding contracts. So what's happening now is that the parts of Aleppo that were destroyed are being rebuilt according to the way that the regime sees it and what they want that city to become. So, it's really problematic. I mean, Syria is my big sort of sore point, but this is the thing. When I look at what's happened at the ICTY and the sorts of things that Mauricio is talking about, you sort of want a tribunal for Syria, but at the same time you don't, because it could just drag on for a long time, and probably the way that the power structures would play out at that tribunal would be very problematic. It's a difficult thing, but I'll see if I can find more about the particular Palmyra situation currently, but I think certainly no firm things have been decided on.
It looks like Roua, Atamaz, Sibai raised their hand.
Please.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. No.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just going off of the conversation that you were just having, I'm Syrian and I'm from Homs and I grew up there during the war. I'm 21 right now, so I kind of like most of my life was the war over there. And going off from the conversation that like rebuilding, especially like historical sites like Palmyra, there was, as you said before, there was like a whole plan that the government is going to rebuild certain sites that looked more modern in a way. That's how they put it, with having like skyscrapers and all of that. However, none of the projects have been put in place or started. And after living there for a while and my family still living there, the question that I keep thinking about is like, when is the right way to rebuild? Because one, the conflict and the war hasn't ended already. And it doesn't seem like it's going to end soon, unfortunately. But then I don't think people are ready to put their money and their effort into rebuilding the historical site where like their houses have been damaged and they'd rather put all of their focus on the houses.
Right.
So I think it's like a really tricky situation to deal with. And I was wondering if like throughout your research, is there like, I don't think there's like a definitive answer to like, when would people start rebuilding or thinking about rebuilding and all of that, especially in case of war, because like whoever rebuilds is the winner, and then no one knows who the winner is right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a friend of mine who's from Homs tells me that because it's what he's noticed there, he lives in London, but what he's noticed there is that because, as you say, because it's too hard to rebuild anything there really at the moment, that people there are interesting projects where people are focusing on education and doing what they can within their own neighborhoods to essentially get their domestic space back in some order or create a domestic space. And there are schemes to educate children. Like there's a program, I don't know if you've heard of it, called The Little Engineer, I think it's called, where children are taught by architects and engineers about how, so yeah, in the face of the ongoing instability and the inability to construct, large buildings, I think there's some move towards trying to at least reestablish normalcy in a sort of, in a small way, in a very localized way. But I think it would have been very troubling to watch if they'd thrown a whole lot of money at rebuilding a site like Palmyra when, as you say, people's living spaces aren't being addressed, so, and you still have family there at the moment?
Yeah, my immediate family is still there. I'm just here to finish my college education.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is the situation in Homs, how has it changed from what you've heard over the past short while?
So what's striking right now, it's like the stuff that you don't think about when the shelling is happening. Like the shelling is kind of stopped in my city from the government side. However, Israel has been shelling like the outskirts of Homs right now. I live in the city center, so we were lucky enough not to flee out of our house. But then what happens like after the war right now and everything is happening and like the electricity cut and the whole like water cut and the whole whole economic situation from like rising the, like, what do you call it, like the rate between the Syrian pound and the US dollars, and how does that affect like the whole economic side, but also other like industries that are coming in. And right now with the whole COVID-19 happening, so like everything is kind of like getting to a worse situation. So like on a day-to-day level, I think people are trying to live their house. I mean, my sister still goes to college there, and my brother goes to school and all of that. So they're still trying to live their everyday life as normal as possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, yeah, I mean, look, and I just was thinking I was going to say, yeah, the other factor, of course, with Syria was that, you know, the embargoes put on spending money there too, which I know for the cultural heritage community, at a certain point meant that, you know, monies that otherwise would have gone to Syria were redirected mostly towards Iraq, because it was, you know, illegal to be supporting any activities in Syria, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I think Elizabeth O'Donnell had a question.
Yeah, hold on. Let me. I need to find my way back. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, Tim. Thanks very much for the film. I believe I saw your film and I watched it sporadically tonight, but I think I saw your film when it was presented at Anthology.
Oh, okay, yeah.
4 years ago, and there seemed to be new parts of the film in here now. But if we could, I'd like to return to this question of the role of monuments and what constitutes a monument, especially in a diverse society. I mean, I was struck by Nader's comment about do the Confederate monuments not do they not serve and reflect a genuine culture? But I think one of the key things that was potentially missing from that argument is the fact that the Confederate monument, people did not object to the Confederate monuments, I think, so much because they did, in fact, reflect on and commemorate a period of time, but because the story was told only from the point of view of one side of that story. So at the time that the Confederate monuments were being built, there were literally no monuments to any of the history of the enslaved peoples that made the economy of the South, and actually the economy of the entire United States, work. So it was the fact that one side, that the story was only told from one side.
Right, exactly, yeah.
You know, and I do think it's an important question because one, I like your point about saying if you kept every monument, then we would run out of room. But, you know, it's a big country, there's lots of space.
Yeah.
There are many stories that need to be told, but I think there's a consistency to the stories that are recorded and those that are not. You know, and and that's kind of one point. But it is, I think it is a fair question. Are the artifacts in Syria given value because of their age? So does it have something to do with time? Does it have something to do with being contemporary to the culture that made them, as opposed to reflective in the way that so many of the Confederate monuments were built actually in the 50s after the war and during a resurgence of Jim Crow and the, you know, the systemic suppression of the civil rights of an entire group of people. So I would expect that this film, being so embedded and immersed in this film, that those questions of, so you brought up the incredibly powerful story of a person who suffered death in order to protect certain cultural artifacts. As we look forward, are we making cultural artifacts that we would give our lives for to preserve in the future? And how do we identify which ones they are?
Yeah, I think that last question is really interesting, and something I've thought about. That I've thought about it, and it's interesting, and to me, it partly relates to your point about does it depend on their age, and the fact that that sort of whatever happens that to our eyes, you know, the structures in Palmyra or you know the Baroque buildings in Dresden are things that we feel are more of value, and that you would more, you know, lay down your life to protect, rather than say one of those, you know, very tall rectangular prisms on 57th Street. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question about the buildings that, things that we're making today or recently, and what connection do we feel? Do we feel a different connection to them than our ancestors may have done, to, you know, the structures in their environment? It's interesting. I mean, I suppose the thing, you know, one of the things from New York's past, which comes back to me is Penn Station, and, you know, the realization around what was the involvement of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and, you know, again, but a monumental building, obviously, and one that was about age as well, but where, you know,
but it actually wasn't. I think Penn Station only was alive for like 50 years.
Oh, okay, right.
It was not an old building.
Yeah.
It was a record of a technology that was changing rapidly. It was
right.
Can I enter this question? Because I think it brings us to a really interesting moment in a way, because most of the responses that I've been hearing are materialist responses. And I think a lot of what this has to deal with is also the immaterial, let's say, life that these monuments, artifacts, things carry. And they carry a culture, they carry a people, they carry lives. And so the reason why I mentioned that is because then in their reconstruction, and mostly their reconstruction by outside forces, I wonder if those reconstructions have anything at all to do with the immaterial life that they had to begin with, right? So if we have, I think it's an Orientalist kind of scope to think that things could be rebuilt. And so I think about Mauricio when she mentioned that seeing that bridge rebuilt isn't necessarily a rebuilding of that bridge, because it hasn't rebuilt the bridge immaterially. It hasn't rebuilt the linkages between the people before the war. And so sometimes an act of rebuilding is actually an act of destruction.
This is an interesting point, Mauricio. You remind me of a competition of about 30 years ago for the souks of Beirut. This is just after the war in Beirut. The entire center of its downtown had been bombed, and the souks, where the marketplace was almost completely destroyed, except for the foundations and rubble of the traces of the stalls. And it turned out that Rafael Moneo eventually won the competition, and he reinstantiated the very footprint of those buildings and stalls and the urban connections they inspired. In other words, effectively to reintegrate the life of the souks back into the city. The problem, of course, was something more fundamental that you bring up, is that what was destroyed with the war was the spice trade, the leather trade, the crafts,
Right.
the agriculture, all of the things that were the underpinnings that would make the souks thrive. And of course, what happened is that with the installation of the parking underneath it, which is a single monolith, and a couple of Givenchy and other kinds of boutiques, it's a perfectly good mall in the center of Beirut.
Sorry.
Not a reflection on Monet, of course. I'm trying to describe a phenomena that is irretrievable and possibly impossible.
Yeah, Amr al-Azam said that to me when his Syrian in the film, that the thing that was most striking to him about the souk in Aleppo was the smells. So, you know, how do you get them back? You have to. The Mostar Bridge to me was interesting too, because when I've talked about it before with people as well, it's like, well, it was a bridge, so therefore it had a functional purpose. And so clearly that functional purpose has been put back, but with absolute, you know, Messiah is saying with nothing else, right? Just the fact that you can walk across the river. Yeah, I mean, it's...
But I mean, also another part that, sorry, it's just, all of these memories have been brought back, and I would say some PTSD due to COVID as well, unfortunately. So everything's kind of hitting me at the same time at the moment, literally, so I'm spilling my guts. Another, you know, I would love to see what the follow-up looks like 20 years from now, you know, for you, where you go back and kind of remap exactly your current geography and route. Yeah. And see the, you know, the next phase of really the erasure of identity and culture. And I think, you know, to my earlier point, I was so incredibly angry afterwards because I just saw it in the generations I was talking to that, you know, it succeeded. The fact that they destroyed schools, libraries, all of these institutions that were, you know, not actually that famous in Mostar really had a severe impact on the new generations. And strangely enough, the city had 5 famous bridges that were constructed throughout different, you know, authors, let's call it, or invaders. So the one that was built during the Ottoman Empire was kind of, you know, obviously the most iconic one. But the irony of it is that the remainder of the Islamic culture is almost gone entirely, even though that icon is there. And I know for a fact I'm going into the minutiae of it, but depending on who gives you the tours, they give a slightly different story to the tourists as to who destroyed it, if it was the Croats or the Serbs, or the Serbs or the Croats. Yeah. So I think there's this continuous kind of blurring, right, of facts. Yeah. That's literally happening because we lost, because, you know, we agreed to something that probably, you know, as you pointed out earlier, what's the alternative? Just for the city to get completely obliterated and everybody dies? Yeah. But the phasing of it is very interesting to me as somebody who still thinks of it every day, and I don't always talk about it the way I'm talking about it this evening at all. Yeah. Just like how much time it actually come to surface and to talk about it, but also to document it and try to, you know, show it in factual steps. Right. Because talking alone, depending on, you know, who you talk to, even myself, is biased. So I think for me, the advent of technology, you know, the one thing that I feel really frustrated about is that we actually didn't have social media when things were happening in Mostar. Yeah. But there was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram. So we were in a black hole for 5 years, and things were written and spoken about what's happening there, but you really didn't know unless you were there. Yeah. So I think another part that's happening now is that, for better or worse, we're immediately familiarized with what's going on, and it's a little bit harder perhaps to rewrite some of these truths. But I wonder, with things that happened over 30 years ago, how do you rewrite or re-document what really occurred, and how does now even technology, the way we have it now, is perhaps making it easier, and I'm not easy in terms of the way I'm using that word right now, for someone like you to, you know, be able to collect the information and to expose it.
I'm mindful of the time and schedule. I have one more question for you, Tim, coming from Gazelle Abbasi. Let me try to unmute her. All right, go ahead.
Thanks, Nader. Frankly, I wasn't going to speak up, but Nader provoked me, so I'll try this. So I've now witnessed this phenomenon twice, where in cities, this destruction of urban fabric, be it in the name of war or modernization, actually results in revolution. As of a few months ago, somehow I played in Lebanon's revolution, which basically at times felt like it was the anti-Solidaire revolution, the entity that built the Beirut souks. And I love the Beirut souks. You know, everybody loves to hate them, but it's a really nice mall. I agree. You know, I go there on a Saturday, I play with my kid. It actually gives us space for the Saturday market. There's a farmer's market. There's also, you know, I mean, we take our scooter. Anyhow, it's nice. It's, you know, yes, there's the Givenchy and the Hermes and all these expensive stores, but, you know, so be it. I mean, who says that, you know, selling hummus is better than selling Gucci? You know, it's commerce at the end of the day, right? So that's one example, but it really produced revolution. And then, but that was destructed as a result of war. In Tehran, large swaths of urban fabric were destructed as a result of modernization. Which is also an act of violence. Yeah. And what that produced, and this is very well documented through Iranian film that was made, I want to say in the 60s and 70s. Now there you might correct me on this. You know, movies like Qaisar, that are essentially kind of manifestations of like a certain destruction of certain cultural practices or social norms that were only possible in certain types of urban fabric, namely the courtyard houses and the kind of, you know, that type of donkey urbanism that was present in the old parts of the city. So, you know, I guess the question is where do you draw the line?
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously in the film we're looking at, you know, just destruction during conflict, but to your point, absolutely, this is that other type of destruction and change, you know, can often be just as insidious, I think, really, and obviously more widespread. It's interesting when it's legal and not legal, and, you know, Messiah was talking about that before in terms of the Mostar context, but I know someone from Cairo who is constantly trying to battle illegal development in Cairo, sort of, you know, the eradication of older parts of the city. But yeah, this is it's absolutely I mean, it's where, I suppose as well, it's where how good national laws are becomes important as opposed to international laws. But, you know, and some countries have better protections than others about this sort of preservation or you know, the limits that can be put on development.
Right, but, you know, I guess part of what I've wondered about is, you know, does architecture become an act of violence? Like, you know, as you know, and somebody like in Moneo's position, I'm sure he was well aware of the fact that of what was happening. You know, the fact that, you know, this kind of really rich urban fabric with the smells and the aromas and all of that was being converted to a mall. You know, as an architect, do you draw the line and say, no, I shall not build because it really is an act of violence, or do you, or, you know, you figure somebody's going to do it, so I'll do it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, well, and that comes, it's interesting, there's a really good documentary about Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, called The Architecture of Doom, which is sort of the opposite of this, exactly, of, you know, building buildings in order to reinforce fascism. and so that's an extreme example, but I think that's what I was getting at too around talking about Aleppo, that, you know, now that the city, those parts of the city were destroyed, you know, you need to bring in then a bunch of architects and engineers to construct, and that sort of construction definitely can be a violent act, absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm not being an architect, you know, but architects may have feelings about that, and yeah.
Right.
We actually have a question from a recent graduate from Cooper, Parker Lemon, who did some work in Egypt. And I think, Parker, do you want to speak up?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the film. It was super great. I was wondering if you could just answer this question as an individual and not a policymaker. Seeing as modern warfare has moved far beyond the Hague Conference and is fought by non-state entities and international law can't keep up, how do we as individuals and not policymakers work ahead of the law, so to speak?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that I think has an optimistic answer, or can do. I think, you know, because, yeah, to your point, because the law takes a long time to act, and because, as we were talking about before in the context of former Yugoslavia, is very problematic. I think that what I notice is the most encouraging actors in all of this are individuals and small groups of people. And for example, you know, I've noticed in the US around the time of the last election, when there were sort of acts of violence perpetrated against Islamic centers and also against Jewish cemeteries in the United States, there were sort of crowdfunding efforts to rebuild those places, in which the funds to rebuild them sort of were gathered either in a day or 2 days. And so, although you may not be getting the sort of justice meted out by a court, there was sort of this power in the general public being able to act, and to be able to act much more quickly than a law court could. So depending on what your skill set is, or what your, you know, what area you work in, I think there are ways to have a voice and to have some sort of positive impact. Yeah, I mean, so I think, although the law is absolutely essential, and particularly in theory, in practice it's not always that way, and it is it can be very unwieldy, and, you know, and I think that's where, again, the beauty of technology and being able to interact in ways like we're doing now, and to be able to sort of project your voice or project issues much more effectively than in the past, I think are good things, you know.
Tim, I wanted to thank you again for being incredibly flexible with everything, with changing of dates and formats and all of that. I really enjoyed the conversation, and like the previous conversation between you and Nader, and the documentary, of course, and now this fantastic, super diverse conversation. I know that we are running out of time, but I wanted to ask you if you could briefly describe the process as a director of editing out, because I guess that you gather a bunch of information, much more than the one that finally got included in the documentary. And I see that process of editing and creating a narrative, kind of like your own view of all the information that you've gathered, almost like as a process of design, as if you were like actually designing any of the buildings that were destroyed, right? So could you briefly describe a little bit that process? And
so yeah, look, I suppose it's, yeah, the hardest part of this was creating that structure and, you know, working out which stories to tell and how to link them together, and what couldn't be included because of the time constraints. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you try to be as objective as possible, but obviously, as we were talking about before, you have to come from a point of view, and but yeah, I mean, essentially the process was, you know, taking Robert's book and working out what the core of it was. His book is structured very differently to the film, so the sort of the chronological approach was one that was just, I think, a lot easier in terms of putting together a framework for telling this story, and so. Yeah, and sort of working around that idea of a century and looking at it across that century at what happened. But yeah, which case studies to include was very difficult, and trying to give some diversity to that at the same time as, you know, centering it around particular cities, like, you know, obviously the three being Sarajevo and Dresden and Aleppo primarily. Trying to not, you know, it's a dense film, obviously, as it is, but trying to minimize that as much as we could, given the, you know, the number of years it was traversing and the, you know, the sort of massive actions that it was trying to make sense of. So there was a difficult thing, and one reason why it was good to have made the film over a fairly long period of time, really, in the end, because it sort of allowed it to grow a bit more organically, and to be able to reflect on what we had and who we'd interviewed and what other sort of voices were needed. So yeah, so it was a complex undertaking. Yeah.
Tim, you've been incredibly generous with your time and with your offerings, so I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody who attended this event tonight, and hope to see you all very soon as our lecture series continues on to the next week. Lorena, you may want to tell us what is the next event.
Sure, we have 2 events next week. One would be the presentation of Andreas Bruckner and Brodler from Basel, Switzerland. They have like an amazing practice. He will be presenting on Tuesday, same format. And then on Thursday, we will have like Andreas Simic presenting on context and pedagogy in a changing landscape. So again, same format. I hope you all can join us also for next week events.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mauricio, for helping to set this up. Mercia also for co-hosting.
Thank you, Tim.